In this podcast, Dr. Andrew Huberman discusses the science behind dopamine and how it affects motivation, desire, and satisfaction. He dispels common myths about the molecule and shares tips on how to leverage it for sustained energy and motivation. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is responsible for many of the brain's functions, including regulating mood, sleep, and appetite. It is also important for movement and time perception. Diseases like Parkinson's and Lewy body's dementia can occur when there is a depletion of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is involved in motivation, drive, and reinforcement. It is released in the brain and body in two different ways: locally, synaptically, and broadly, volumetrically. The volumetric release is like a giant vomit that gets out to a large number of cells. Dopamine affects motivation, drive, and focus in different ways. It works by stimulating the release of glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Dopamine is important for goal-oriented behavior and tracking pleasure and success. The podcast begins with a discussion of the biology of dopamine transmission, before sharing two anecdotes that illustrate the profound impact dopamine can have on our experience. The first anecdote is about the tragic case of a group of young people who became severely paralyzed after taking a drug that was contaminated with MPTP. The second anecdote is about the author's personal experience with giardia, an intestinal infection that caused him to experience extremely low levels of dopamine. Dopamine and adrenaline are closely related and work together to create different experiences. Dopamine colors the subjective experience of an activity to make it more pleasurable, while adrenaline is more about energy. He continues to discuss how different activities can impact dopamine levels in the brain. For example, chocolate consumption can increase dopamine levels by 1.5 times, while exercise may only have a minor impact depending on how much the person enjoys it. The podcast also discusses how caffeine can increase the effects of dopamine. Dopamine helps us seek out things that we need or want. It is released when we achieve something that we are seeking, but then it quickly drops back down to a lower level than before. This is why we sometimes feel a post-celebration or post-accomplishment slump. The pleasure-pain balance refers to the fact that when we seek something we like or indulge in it, there is a pleasure but also pain that exceeds the amount of pleasure. This is because after the dopamine rush from the activity or substance wears off, we experience a lack of dopamine, which causes pain. The dopamine system is responsible for motivation, focus, and satisfaction. However, when people pursue activities that lead to huge increases in dopamine, the dopamine baseline drops afterward, leading to addiction and depression. It is important to understand the relationship between the peaks and baseline of the dopamine system in order to make good choices that will maintain a healthy dopamine level. Dopamine is a good thing, but it is important to not overindulge in activities or substances that lead to big dopamine peaks. This can deplete the dopamine levels in the brain and lead to problems like addiction or misdiagnosis of ADHD. The key is to engage in activities that release dopamine intermittently so that the brain doesn't become accustomed to always expecting big dopamine hits. Dr. Andrew Huberman discusses the role of dopamine in motivation, focus, and satisfaction. He explains that dopamine is released in response to rewarding stimuli and that it plays a crucial role in regulating our behavior. However, too much dopamine can lead to problems such as addiction or desensitization to its effects. Therefore, it's important to control our dopamine levels and engage in activities that release dopamine intermittently. Dr. Huberman provides several examples of how to control dopamine levels. For example, he explains how to attach dopamine to effort and strain rather than to a specific process or reward. This can help to regulate dopamine levels and maintain motivation and focus over the long term. He also discusses the benefits of intermittent fasting as a way to regulate dopamine levels. By temporarily depriving the brain of dopamine, fasting can help to reset our dopamine baseline and make everyday activities more enjoyable. Dr. Huberman also touches on the use of supplements to adjust dopamine levels. He cautions against taking supplements without consulting a doctor and highlights the potential side effects of popular supplements like mecunapirions and L-tyrosine. In addition, he discusses the role of social interactions and oxytocin in releasing dopamine. He explains how positive social interactions can boost dopamine levels and lead to greater motivation and focus. Preclinical studies suggest that oxytocin activity in the hypothalamus, a gland in the brain that regulates the hormone systems, contributes to the release of dopamine. Dopamine released in these pathways supports the brain's reward systems, resulting in positive feelings. Throughout the podcast, Dr. Huberman emphasizes the importance of controlling dopamine levels for optimal motivation, focus, and satisfaction. He provides these practical tips and insights for regulating dopamine levels and engaging in activities that release dopamine intermittently. This is the end of the Podslice. Your Dopamine for Motivation, Focus and Satisfaction Huberman Lab Podcast number 39. If you are still here, please post in the comment section for any podcasts that you would like summarized in this format, and I'll do my best to get it up as soon as possible. Thank you for watching.